Welcome back. The aim of this first week in our BIB 314 course on Jesus and the Christian community is intended to simply introduce the Gospel of Matthew, as well as give you a guide or an orientation to the kinds of questions we're going to ask of the text and of the world in which we live. So you're going to see a succession of three very short videos focusing on three different circles or contexts, which, as you'll see by the diagram on the Moodle webpage, they kind of overlap, and it's in the intersection of these three worlds that we really want to encounter Matthew's gospel and the person of Jesus and the message that he proclaimed and that he represented. So those three worlds, these overlapping circles, are literary context, historical context, and contemporary context. And each of the three videos will take up one of these in succession. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about literary context. What do we mean by that? Well, very briefly and in summary, we might say that literary context looks at the world in the text, the world of the text. In other words, looking at the actual words that you encounter as you read Matthew's gospel, taking into consideration the kinds of things you're actually reading, the words on the page. That's the literary context. But there are two ways in which we can think about literary context, which I want to alert you to just very briefly, and you'll explore this in more detail as you read through the chapters in the Fee and Stewart text. And the first is this: literary context can refer to a wider set of books or texts, a library, if you will, of ancient documents. And we can read not just the Bible, because the Bible is actually a collection itself of at least 66 distinct texts. And as many of you will know, in the Catholic tradition, more than 66. So in the ancient library of texts, we encounter something like Matthew's Gospel as one text or one document or one book that gives us a sense of the world in which people lived. But one of the ways in which we can understand Matthew's gospel is to read other literature, or to understand Matthew's gospel as coming from an entire library of ancient books. That's one way to think of literary context. But the more important way to think of it for this class and this particular session here in week one is that literary context focuses on the words of the text. So things like grammar, sentence structure, the images, the symbols, the metaphors, the actual words on the page. How do we define those words? What's the relationship of those words to each other? Because that's how human beings construct meaning, right? We hear words and we understand what those words mean in terms of a definition, and then we understand what they mean in relationship to one another. So, and that's all. That's a skill that we all automatically bring. When we hear someone speak or when we read a text, we put these things together. And the literary context of a biblical text like the Gospel of Matthew is no different. We're simply coming to terms with, what do the words actually mean? And this is one half of what we call exegesis. The word exegesis simply means to draw meaning out of. And the first way we draw meaning from a text is to understand what the words mean and how they relate to one another. So you want to pay attention to how the person of Jesus, the things that he says and the things he represents, are presented in Matthew's gospel. Be prepared to listen to dialogue between different characters. How are those characters characterized? How are they presented in the text? And then what's the overall storyline or the arc of the story that Matthew is telling? Just remember that ancient writers, much like writers today, had certain conventions and expectations when they wrote. They were writing assuming that they would be understood. So one of the things that literary context can help us do is understand the words on the page, their relationship to one another, and what it was that the ancient author was trying to communicate in his own words, in his own time, with those meanings. So as you look at some of the resources in this week, just keep that brief overview of literary context in mind. It's paying attention to the other ancient literature, and it's also paying attention to the words on the page, the actual bits and pieces that construct a text like the one we're looking at, the Gospel of Matthew. And when we get back to the next video, I'll talk a bit more about a second circle of context, and that is historical context.